Hey, everybody, welcome to Tuesday Tips Live. I'm excited to be here today. As you might know, people are starting to show up onto the live feed here. I am here today with Quanita Roberson is going to be my guest. Oh, look who just joined. I'm waving. Joy is here too. Yara is here. Oh, this is so fun. Oh, you want to be in my live video, Quanita? Why, look at that. Yes. Yes. So exciting. I'll wait for the live magic to happen. I just clicked for you to, oh, the magic is happening.
I tell you, the places you take me.
I know. I'll take you anywhere. This morning, you'll laugh at this. This is very silly, very like woo-woo, but I was meditating, and when I was meditating, I all of a sudden noticed that I was on like an orange dragon. I like flied to, I flied, good grammar, Melissa. I flew to, and she doesn't even know it yet. I'll let her know. I flew to my friend Gabe's house on an orange dragon.
Oh, you know, it's so interesting because I was watching the Disney Dragon show last night.
Oh, yeah?
Yes, it's pretty good. Lots of water in it. So for me being a water spirit, it just really fit.
Oh, I love it. I love it. That's on my list, and I have not watched that dragon film yet. I've got the Disney Plus, and I've got access to it, so I'm excited to see it. Did you like it?
I loved it. You got to watch it.
Okay, good. Okay, it's on the list. Maybe, who knows? Maybe I'll watch it tonight.
Yes.
Maybe I'll watch it tonight.
Yes.
Well, welcome today.
Thank you very much.
I so enjoyed our conversation yesterday, which was sort of a little bit of a prep call for our Tuesday Tips Live, because you and I can talk for hours, and we obviously, don't worry, have no fear, Instagram. Have no fear, Instagram. We're not going to talk for hours. We will not keep you on for hours. But it is noted that we're birthday twins.
We are. Not only the same day, but we were born the same year, too.
The same day, the same year. And I can't remember, what time were you born?
I was born at like 6:13 in the morning. Okay.
I was a nighttime baby. So
I'm the older one.
You're the older. you kicked twin. Me. You landed in the universe before I did by a few hours. Oh, goodness. Well, it's interesting because at the age that we are, which is a fancy age, I like that you called it being a baby elder.
Yes, at 50, I think I can claim that.
Yeah, right? We can be a baby elder. So we're baby elders, and here we are. And so it does shift how we look at the world.
Definitely.
And you used this phrase, sense making, like we are sense making in the world.
Yes.
And I love that, just because I hate, it's overused, the word uncertainty, but there is a lot of uncertainty that we're grappling with, and it's the norm, and it's fine, and we're all, we got it. But I think that people look to have sense made for them instead of like making sense. Yes. And so I would just love for you to describe for us what sense making looks like to you.
Well, I think as humans, we're all trying to make sense of the world around us, and sometimes we do that by ourselves. Sometimes we do that in a community. Sometimes we do that with just a partner, like what's happening here? What's going on? We're not ones that usually are satisfied just kind of doing everything we're told and just walking around and not asking any questions. And so this piece about being curious in the world, matter of fact, I think we need to cultivate more and more curiosity in the world.
Yeah. Well, and then the curiosity is a much better match with uncertainty than a need to know.
Yes, because the truth is, like, we've just been living with the illusion of knowing. We haven't really known before, I said we're addicted to the illusion of safety and security, but not real safety and security. And so, if we weren't aware that we were in an unpredictable world before, then of course it could be a little discombobulating when COVID happened and all the unrest and everything feels like it's all changing. But the truth is, change is the one thing we can all always depend on. Nothing remains the same, not even a bellyache. In the time that you have it, it ebbs and flows. Everything changes.
Luckily,
Yes.
those belly
Yes.
aches. I'm
Yes.
glad that they changed.
It'll stay forever.
Yeah. And, we kind of jumped right into it, but I'd like to give some context for the people that are with us. Quanita and I met in the Shakti Leadership Program. It's a leadership program about working with working with like your masculine energy, working with your feminine energy, and how that comes through in your leadership. And it was a fascinating process, and that's how we got to know each other. But please share with our audience the lens at which you're kind of looking at this sense making.
I think for me, one of the things that I'm up to these days is I'm a co-host of a journey called Fire and Water. It's a leadership rites of passage journey, and it's a journey for adults. And the whole idea is that looking at the world, what we've come up with is that we're mostly an adolescent adult culture. And so this question about, how do we grow up as adults? How do we not just get older, but really grow up? And, the problem with being adolescent adults is that if we don't have any initiated adults, then we can't have initiated elders. And if we don't have initiated elders, we can't initiate our youth. So it ends up being this like cycle that repeats itself. And so I think that's part of what we found ourselves in, this culture full of adolescent adults. And so the question came then, how do you initiate adults? And in our conversation, my co-host, his name is Tennyson Wolf, he and I were talking about how we don't have a lack of leadership programs in the world. We spend tons of money actually on leadership development programs. And I even would say we don't have a lack of leaders, because leaders just means people are following you. It says nothing about where you're taking them. We have a lack of wise, soulful leaders. And so Fire and Water journey is about cultivating wise, soulful leaders in the world.
Yeah. And that's definitely an inside out job. That's not that you don't read some books.
It's not a books. Step.
No, it's not a 5-step, 10-step, 12-step. It's not. It doesn't have a bunch of letters attached to it.
Yes. Matter of fact, the journey is a 16-month journey that we host with adults from across the country. And actually, this time around, we have a couple of Canadians with us too.
Oh, yay. We love the Canadians.
Yes. Tennyson, my co-host, is Canadian, actually. He lives in Utah, but he was born and raised in Canada.
That's excellent. And it's kind of the perfect time for that right now, because I feel so many of my friends and colleagues, everybody seems to be more called forth lately to show up differently in however they're leading their lives.
Yeah,
right?
I think, one of the things I've been saying about the pandemic is, what better gift to give a culture that has forgotten how to grieve than a pandemic? Because I believe if we don't know how to grieve, you don't know how to live. And so, there's a guy, Martin Prechtel of Mind Descent. One of the things that he speaks about is that grief isn't sadness, grief is release. So he says, when we're grieving the thing that we've lost, we call it grief. But when you're grieving the thing that you've got, we call it praise. He says, because to really know how to praise something, you need to know what would be lost if it was gone. And so, examining our relationship with grief is so important. And we're in a culture that likes to deny it, or to avoid it, or to run from it, or that we think we can do it by ourselves, which I think is another myth around grief.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that comes through in all of your bios and in your work is this notion of addressing embedded trauma.
Yeah.
Right? And that comes from not addressing grief when it happens, yes. Right? Yeah. So can you say more about what it looks like to, what give us an example of an embedded trauma?
Well, I think that, one of the things I think is that emotions that we have, because we block so many of our emotions, or our feelings, I will say, When we block our feelings from just flowing through, what they then turn into, I think, are these emotions that start to rule us because we don't just let it go and let it, flow out. And so it's this piece around trauma wants to be healed. Trauma for me is just an overload of the system. And that can be in lots of different ways. It can be, and what's an overload in my system may not be an overload for your system. But anytime there's an overload in the system, I think we experience a form of trauma. And the thing about trauma is trauma wants to be healed. So it'll always float to the surface. So that's why when people get into these patterns, they'll meet someone who's abusive and then they'll get out of it, and they'll meet another person who's abusive and they'll get out of it, because it's the trauma trying to be healed. So it keeps coming to you. And instead of thinking, oh, something's wrong, really getting, oh, it's trying to give us an opportunity to attend to this and heal that wound so I don't have to do this again.
Yeah. I've been doing a lot of work with positive neuroplasticity over the past year. And the Rick Hansen is the teacher, and he talks about, he just calls everything material. Oh, that's great material. This is fresh material that will allow you to access, what happened to you 30 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But it's new material that is giving you the same sort of wake up.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And the reason I think that happens is I have been taught and say often that the world is out to gift us and not to get us. And so when things happen, so often we ask, why is this happening to me? But actually the more appropriate question is, why is this happening for me? And just that little change in that question changes everything. First of all, the to me keeps us in victim space and victim consciousness. The for me and is about agency and empowerment. If we really get it, it's trying to get me to learn or to grow a muscle or do something, but it's happening for my benefit, not to my detriment.
Yeah, I love that. So I want to underline that for people, that the universe is out to gift me, not to get me, and things are happening for us, not to us. Like, I just want to, I wish I had, I could scroll it across the Instagram screen right now, but that's a quote to hang on to. And it's also a good moment to say, hey, I see the people that are here live. If you have questions, I see people commenting. Thank you, Yara.
Yeah.
If you have questions, feel free to put the questions in the comment area, and we can talk about them. So anyhow, sorry, I wanted to put a little button on that. So what does you talked about going it alone, and how going it alone doesn't necessarily, that's not always necessarily a most successful path. So how do we sense make together, especially lately?
Yeah, I think first is knowing that we can't go it alone. I've often, Tennyson and I actually have a podcast that we record. And one of the things that we talked about was this whole idea of the myth of independence. I think that to me, independence actually is a trauma response. It's that we experience a trauma and we think that the divine left us. And so we think then that we're responsible for our own survival. And so we go into this independence kind of mode. But the truth is that we're always all dependent. We breathe the same air. We walk the same earth. We're always dependent. The question then becomes, are we standing in scarcity and lack and therefore codependent? Are we standing in love and abundance and therefore interdependent? But it's not a question of whether we're independent or dependent. I think we mistake being an individual for being independent. And I would say you get to be an individual, you don't get to be independent.
Yeah, there is, and especially in our culture, it's such a it's so supported.
It's foundational. We have the Declaration of Independence. Think about that. If we even went and changed the Declaration of Independence to what would it look like if we rewrote it to the Declaration of Interdependence, and what that might do and look like and help and support in us.
Yeah, and even just the arguments or the discussions that come up around what independence looks like and actually who gets it,
Yeah.
right? If when we're interdependent, that's not even a question.
No, no. And I think, especially now in our culture, we want other people to take care of us or be responsible for us. We don't want to take responsibility. That's the adolescent piece, with all of the freedoms and none of the responsibility, which I think has shaped so many of our conversations. One of the things I think I shared with you yesterday, even this whole idea of organizations becoming anti-racist organizations, it's like that to me is a signal that it's rooted in the wound and not in a healed space, because a healed person would never claim anti anything. But we just take it for granted that, somebody else is supposed to fix things for us, or we just keep recreating the same thing in these different iterations.
Yeah. So what does that look like on an organizational level? Like what does that look like because it seems like there's a path that needs to go
Yes.
through, that healing doesn't happen overnight.
Yes.
So what are some of the elements of that healing path?
Well, one of the first things I've done with some agencies and organizations is we go into organizational grief. Even grief happens on different layers. It happens on a personal layer, but it also happens on a communal layer. So like your race or your gender or your company or your family, it happens on that ethnocentric layer. And so tending to grief on a organizational layer. And that happens in multiple ways. Like it can be when a person leaves a job, even if they leave a job under good circumstances, there still is a grief attached to them being gone. A project ending, there's grief with that. And when we're not tending to that grief, what happens is someone new comes in and there's not really space for them in the same way if we tended to the grief to clear out the way for them to come. And so they hear a lot of, oh, well, so-and-so used to do it this way, because we haven't really tended to the grief that's there, and it can be as simple as that, but it also can be even more serious. There was an organization that I hosted a grief ritual and workshop for, that had a young person take his own life. And so it wasn't just, one of the things I said to them, it's not just that you as individuals are changed, you as an organization has changed when something like that happens. And so tending to both.
Yeah. Yeah. And what about, there are certain things that I don't know that upper management would say that a company reorganization or a merger would be, something to grieve, right? But when cultures are shifting or cultures are merging, it seems like that's another area where that organizational grief might be present.
Definitely. A friend, Peter Block, one of the things that he has said and does in his conversations, he talks about what crossroads, the question he asks often is, what crossroads do you find yourself at today? The thing I like about that question of what crossroads do you find yourself at is that it makes an assumption that we're always at a crossroads. And if you're always at a crossroads, there's always an ending and a beginning. And so there's always something you can be grieving. Now, that's not to say in organizations that we want to be in a constant state of grief, but it does mean that if we don't tend to it, it builds up in us. So what are we putting in place, or what structures do we have to tend to some of that so that it's not as messy? Because what happens when you don't tend to the grief and you don't do the release, then your processes are just messier and they take longer in the long run.
Yeah.
Which also then isn't good for business.
No. So for example, what are typical challenges that you are getting called to work with today in organizations? Not necessarily just today, but in general.
Yeah, so some of them is like there are coming together of different organizations. There's a organization I'm working with that 3 different states have come together to form one, under one umbrella. And so that requires, kind of a new sets of agreements, new like common language. Which requires being willing to let go of what used to be. And there's grief in that, especially, they have a new leader that holds things in a different way. We're called to work with organizations that right now, in a time of not only COVID, but George Floyd and his murder and the whole country trying to figure out where we are around race, that so many organizations are asking us to come and even host spaces to hold some of those conversations. Because, one of the things is you can't get something new without giving up something old. There's no room for it. The universe hates a vacuum, so it'll always fill it up, And so being intentional then about the things that we want and even how we're having the conversations, because I think we actually have been having the wrong conversations around race.
Well, that leads to the question, what would be the conversation to be having?
Yeah, so I think part of it is that we've been skipping, we skip the personal piece. We have forgotten that you can't give what you don't have. And so if you don't have a level of love and care and compassion for me, there's no way you can have it, or for yourself, there's no way you can have it for me. And so, when we bring people in a room and we're trying to get situations where they have compassion for the other person, we haven't yet asked the question, do you have it for yourself? And so this piece about tending to our internal first, so that then we have the capacity to be in real relationship with each other.
So is there a moment when people say are receiving new information or in the midst of the trauma? So like if we take the George Floyd murder, or we take somebody learning about Tuskegee for the first time, or learning something new, and it sort of opens them up, right? So is there a moment where it's not that person is not compassionate with themselves, but they just don't know how to, like, they could lose compassion for themselves because of new realizations, or they are at an understanding gap?
Yeah, I think that that brings me to the thought of around shame, blame, and guilt. So often we are in situations and we've kind of married shame, blame, and guilt and responsibility in this culture, but they're very different things. I think often we go to shame, blame, and guilt so we don't have to take responsibility. But shame, blame, and guilt don't really serve anybody. They actually are where we hide from the emotions. So the moment I hear them show up in a room, the first question I ask is, what are you trying not to feel? And oftentimes that's just deep grief. When we don't know what to do, we want to just go and try to fix it, right? Instead of be in it. And that's just another way of running from our feelings. Because it's not good to feel grief. I mean, it's good. It just doesn't feel good to feel grief. Yeah.
No, it doesn't feel good to be in that place. There's, with the work that I do with emotional intelligence, one of the things that I'm always looking at is, different ways of how we use emotions, especially emotions that aren't comfortable. And I will never forget this moment. This is easily 10, 15 years ago, when I had had an especially hard day at work, and I was walking home and I was so frustrated and I was so angry, and I got off the train. I started walking towards my house, and it's funny, I lived off of Division, and there was a hospital, and the hospital, there was this icon of sort of like the outline of what like a nun's habit would look like, right? I can't remember the name of the hospital. And I just saw it way out there in the distance by where I was heading. And I just focused on it. And I just felt like I'm so surprised I didn't go up in flames that night, Quanita, when I was walking home. But I was like, okay, I'm going to feel like all of this, because then it multiplies. So the one thing that might have gotten you angry then might trigger something else that happened to you in your childhood. It might trigger something else that's going on in the world. And then before you know it, this thing is everything. And I just felt like I was just going up, and I just let it go. I wrote it out. And by the time I got home, I felt fine. I almost felt like purified. It seems like a weird thing to say, but I just let the emotion alchemize so that I could then be present. Because if I just ran or hid from it, it wouldn't do me any good. It would show up someplace else. I'd spill milk and I'd get mad, or I'd lose my cell phone and I'd get mad,
Yeah, I think one of the one of the reasons that we avoid grieving is we think that grief requires suffering. But I don't think that's true. I think the suffering is the resistance to the grief. It's not the grief itself. The grief itself is just sad, but it's not suffering if you let it just flow through you. And so what I hear you speaking to is that just letting it flow through you. And when you let it just flow through you, you can get to the other side of it, which often there's a gift there's a gift on the other side of the wound of whatever that grief was, and so only though sitting through it do we also get access to the gift.
Yeah. Oh, Yara has a good comment there. She says, I found myself relieving grief, but not healing it. So
Yes.
feeling like,
Yeah.
So what would you say to that? What's the difference between that relief and healing?
Community. This is where, in this culture, we tell ourselves we can grieve alone, but grief requires community, because we'll never go to the bottom in the depths of our grief without knowing somebody's there to hold space for us, because we're all afraid we'll drown in it. And so having someone who can see and doesn't feel it in the way that you are, that can say, no, keep going. You won't drown in it. Keep going. I'm here. I'm watching you. Then you can go all the way to the other side, and you don't just wallow in it, but you actually move through it. That then gives you access to the gifts. That's why so often when we grieve, afterwards, the immediate feeling after grief is often this lightness, this joy that rushes in.
Yeah. What would you say about working with these tougher emotions or excuse me, embedded trauma, across divides where people are coming from different perspectives, different points of view? How do you create a together when there is an us and them?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think at times I do it really well, and at times I don't, right? And I think part of it is that it's realizing that we're not othered. I do a lot of circle work, and one of the things I love about circle is that it can help you remember not only do we belong to each other, but we are each other. That the only thing that can show up for me is a reflection of what's internal. And now that may look differently in the external than the internal. That's why if I ask that question, why is this happening for me, I can get a lot of really good information from that. But the going together, I think, is that we have forgotten that we cannot not belong. We're all birthed from the same place. Now, your wounds may show up differently than mine. And there's a piece where it's how do we really keep leaning in and listening for what's being felt and said, and see each other, But I think one other thing I'll just add is I've also learned that I can't see the other person in places that I can't see me. It's like if I'm not ready to really see me at that depth, I can't witness you.
Yeah. It reminds me of, I'm a massive Cobra Kai fan and Karate Kid fan. And I was listening to an interview with William Zabka, who plays Johnny Lawrence. And so he was being asked about how he accessed, he's such a nice guy, and he's playing this kind of anti-hero. And he's like, but there's no character that I could ever play where I couldn't find a seed of something in that character, right? So actors, when we hear actors talk about that, it's a good reminder, we all can access that, right?
Maya Angelou has said, one of the things she said, there's a video she did where she talks about how the best thing that a human can achieve, we're all capable of. Maybe not but it's in us, our human stuff that make us. If another human can do it, that's possible, right? And it's the same with the worst thing that a human can do. We're all capable of, given the right circumstances. It's possible. And I think we forget that because we like to think there's good and there's the bad, instead of we have all of it in us, you know. And the good and the bad actually is one of the ways that we keep from taking responsibility for ourselves, because as long as they're the bad one over there, then we don't have to take responsibility. But it also works the other way. If I'm just the bad one, then I don't have to take responsibility either, right? If I've just designated myself as that. And so both pieces actually keep us from growing up.
Right. And those pieces are linked in with the whole notion of having shame be there instead of
Yes.
responsibility. If there's, okay, I messed up, no shame in messing up,
Yeah.
and I'm going to fix it, and I'm going to move forward, and it's happening for me and not to me, then there's this it feels more whole moving through that, as opposed to having to ping pong into this good and bad, and it does seem to increase the suffering of what could be a more simple process.
Yes. I mean, I think that, again, that giving ourselves some grace and compassion, you know, and yes, that also means that we still are responsible for the things that we do, but each of us usually carry a piece of the responsibility. In relationship, it's not ever all one person or the other, you know. And I think that we kind of shy away from that conversation because we don't want to feel like we're doing victim blaming, right? But again, if it's happening for us, even that is trying to get us get us to learn something or grow something in us. And so it's a different conversation. You know, I want us to be a little bit more curious. Curiosity is the opposite of judgment. And so this piece about when I find myself being judgmental of myself or of another, it's an invitation for me to step into curiosity.
Yeah. So what I'm really sensing here is, because my mind always starts to go at systems. Okay,
Yeah.
The justice system, the educational system, the economic systems, all of these things, and it's not. It feels not so much about the systems. It feels like how we approach the systems and the energy that we're bringing to them. Right.
Well, even the systems is a way of othering, because we are the systems. We like to say it's the systems, but they are us. And so often it's like, this is just the way it's been done here. This is our culture. Well, if you're part of that culture, then if you shift the culture shifts.
Right.
Again, all the dancing we do to not take responsibility is pretty, interesting to watch and to witness, right?
Yeah, it's just another vantage point of looking at it like, okay, wait a minute, it's the systems. Okay, wait a minute, I am part of this system.
Yes.
So how am I interacting?
Yes. So
within this
the
system?
Question then I would ask, if I'm part of the system, how am I contributing to this problem that I think exists?
Right.
Because we all contribute. Or how can I contribute to eliminating this problem I think exists?
Yeah. It creates a whole new level of self-responsibility.
Yeah. And that's the growing up. That's the, being a grown-ass person, is how do we step into being responsible for ourselves and being able to consider other people too, in that. In the initiation in Fire and Water, one of the things that I hope is that people move from this place of the adolescent adult to a more initiated adult. And initiation, to me, there's lots of different initiations we can go through life, but the ones that we're focused on in Fire and Water is this initiation from childhood to adulthood. And there is a moving then from being earth-centered and led in our decision-making to being spirit-centered and led in our decision-making, because that's what initiation asks of us. Not that we ignore the earthly things, but that they don't lead our decision-making process.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of a good point for us to look at that. So, okay, so if you have for the folks that are still on, if you have a question, and actually, if you're watching this Instagram Live later, Quanita and I are tagged in this post. So just feel free to ask questions or comments, or
Definitely.
DM Quanita on her Instagram page. I'll put information and how you can contact Quanita in the comments, so that will be available to you. But you also have a book that will be coming out by the end of the year. So it's the Underground Railroad, a 40-day journey to heal soul and spirit. I got that right,
Yes.
yeah? Did I get that?
To
Did I get it
remembering,
right?
well, close
Okay.
to remembering soul and spirit, but
To
yes.
remembering soul and
Yes,
spirit. Okay.
yes. But I co-authored a book with Amy Houghton, and she's a white woman from the Kentucky side of the Ohio River, and I'm a black woman on the Ohio side of the Ohio River. And we talk about our own journeys to freedom, and then we walk you through a 40-day journey of your own. And so in the book, it's, how do we start each healing our own wounds? I think one of the biggest misconceptions around the legacy of slavery is that it's just carried by people of color. But to enslave a person, there's a part of you that has to be enslaved as well. And so each of us have to do our own work. There's the slave archetype, the shadow side is being a slave to a person, a thing, or even an idea. But the light side of the slave archetype is being a slave to the divine spirit within. It actually teaches us self-mastery. It's how we find our freedom. And so we each need to do that work on our own. Nobody else can do it for us. I often say that I don't want you all to be my ally. I want you to save your own damn self. And then if me saving you and I save me, then we're good, right? Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Although, when I hear the word ally, the first thing that I think of is like superhero movies, right?
Yeah.
So, right, like, and you want to have your all of your friends and all of their superpowers accessed, so that you can connect and you can share your superpowers too. It's so fun to share
That's what I think.
superpowers.
I think that's what happens, so in the growing up. In the growing up, we get access to the unique gifts that you've brought on this world, in this earth. And I actually think it's the most underutilized resource that we have. We could solve all the earth's problems by initiating all of the adults, because we each come with a genius to solve a problem, but we're not getting access to that because we're not growing up. We're just growing older.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about you, but I much prefer growing up to growing older.
Yes. Me too. Sometimes it's not so fun, but but yes, definitely.
Well, we can share. We share that one.
Yes.
So, okay. Well, thank you everybody that has
Very much.
that's watching, and this is one of those Tuesday tips that it's less about answers and it's more about questions. It's more about noticing. So, yeah. So, food for thought, and thank you for joining us. And Quanita, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Melissa.
Please, everyone, follow Quanita on her Instagram page. You'll find out more about Fire and Water, the Fire and Water cohort,
Yes.
which actually starts in August, right?
Yes, there's another cohort starting in August. We're in one that started in February, but we're starting a second one in August. So if you're interested, please reach out.
Yeah, and so I'll share the links below, or reach out directly to Quanita, and stay tuned for the book, and just follow her work. It's amazing. I love and adore you, Quanita.
Thank you. I love you too. I'm so glad. Thank you for inviting me on. It's good to be
Oh my
here.
gosh, this was so fun. This was so fun. Okay, and now this is the fun part where I try to turn it all off, and I always forget how to turn it all off. I think I just click the X. Anyhow,
Yes.
Thank you everybody for joining us.
Take care.